The X-Men Omnibus Volume 1 came out in 2021 and it's still a great book. I really love this one. It's got 750 odd pages and I paid about 60 or about 70 quid. It was $100 when it came out. I don't know if it's still in print or not. However, let's just go through the book. Really great book featuring, of course, the early adventures of the X-Men, and it's just great, glorious, colourful design. However, should be aware there is also a Taschen book, a huge book that includes lots of the stories that are in here, but more like the originals. So these have been cleaned up and restored, etc. So the colour is not perhaps for everyone. Obviously, you've got Jack Kirby, Verma Roth, Alex Toth, etc., and a few others as well. And here's the stories themselves. Now, the stories include all the way through to the X-Men issue 31. So you've got X-Men 1 all the way through to 31. Lots of great stories. The Sentinels, Magneto, of course, Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, and many others. Now, it comes with, of course, an introduction, but lots of these introductions were actually quite a while ago. These ones, like obviously 1987. Personally, I wish they would have updated lots of these intros. They always seem to just go for the ones that were in the Marvel Masterworks. But still, you've got the covers, you've got to see there, the X-Men swinging in to Magneto. Not certain actually what Marvel Girl is doing there. There doesn't seem to be much indication there. But of course, the Fantastic Four. This came out in 1963, a little bit after, of course, the success of the Fantastic Four. And also came out at the same time as the Avengers. Well, of course, you've got all the characters coming in and, well, quick demonstration of some of their various things they can do. Of course, over the years, some of them have changed a bit, probably more than others. The Beast, of course, now is really a beast. And also, Iceman was more a snowman in the early days. Well, we've also, of course, got the fun characters as well. And of course, some action happening here. But, of course, at this point, we don't see Magneto. But what we do get is that the lesson ends, because this is a school, and Professor X communicates to, obviously, the X-Men that something's going to change. Marvel Girl comes, and straight away you've got this element of romance, love between all the characters, and also a demonstration of her powers. But also, you've got Professor X as he sort of goes out, the evil mutants. Of course, I never think that the actual mutants ever called themselves the evil mutants. I don't know if they ever did call themselves that. But the moment is at hand. Now, I always think it's slightly odd because I'm quite certain that Magneto had been doing a lot more before that. I'm certain this is not the first real appearance of Magneto. So I've always found that slightly odd. But of course, at this point, it was, as far as we're concerned, the early appearance. And of course, Magneto goes into this army compound and his control obviously manipulates the ballistic missile there. And the X-Men fly off to save the day. And this is a bit strange. Marvel Girl's really only just joined, but straight away she's involved in the action. And of course, you got there Cyclops bashing away. And he sort of can't, the power, the awesome power. Again, this is something later where I think Magneto's powers were considered, obviously made him one of the great powers in the Marvel Universe. So perhaps that was a bit, still, I love the way he manipulated, obviously, all the various metals there. But of course, he learned later on he can manipulate even more things than that. In particular, obviously, control minds as well. But this is an early, brilliant bit of Jack Kirby. Great story. And of course, the X-Men escape and so does Magneto. He flies off and of course, he doesn't capture him. At this point, you notice that the army and various FBI, etc., all have some sort of connection with the X-Men. I think that sort of faded a bit later on, but you've got here the Vanisher. No one can stop the Vanisher. And of course, we've got the White House here as well. I always love that cover. I think that was just a great, nothing can stop the Vanisher. Well, other than obviously a slight problem where he transfers because he's doing it super fast. But of course, there's a complication there. And again, you've got the X-Men going out round, saving various people. But you've got here the Vanisher. Some really odd characters. I think virtually every Marvel comic story, the second issue always seemed to be a bit of a weird one because you had like the Skrulls, which of course high impact, but it was an odd story. You had the Avengers with Space Phantom, of course, issue 2, and so on. Issue 2, you got the Vanisher. Now, he did appear later, of course, but he was an odd villain. You had like the terrible Tinkerer and those sort of people, the Chameleon. And you got obviously all the various crime bosses that are going up to the Vanisher. Now, of course, later on, I suspect no one wanted to really have much dealings with the Vanisher. But I love this with Professor X communicating with this device. Just absolutely great. Of course, later on, I don't think anything like that happened. And there he is, capturing Marvel Girl. Well, of course, they solve it slightly in a really bad way for the poor old Vanisher, but still. We've got here, Beware the Blob. Now, for me, this is probably the earliest story of the X-Men that I saw, and I love this one. I think it was one of the annuals. Can't remember. I think it was the Fantastic Annual. And it was just, to me, the Blob was just a great character, a circus. And it was really nice because he was in a circus. They wanted him to become part of the X-Men, of course. And you can see him just blasting there. And didn't really, to endear yourself, obviously, with the X-Men, and you can see obviously there he even gets an ice cube around his foot, but he goes back to the circus, and then of course he decides, you know what, I'm going to take on the X-Men, and he does quite well for a bit, but of course things don't work out for him. However, what we have got is probably the classic tale, the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, and this was, I think, probably this had been issue 1, that would have been amazing, but this is issue 4, and of course we've got Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch, which I always love it, in green, especially red inside. It's, of course, we're more, now she's called the Scarlet Witch, but still, we've got here Mastermind and of course Toad as well, and I love this with the X-Men on the front there. I think just a great cover. Well, issue 4, you got here the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. Again, I suspect they never called them that. But inside, of course, you got the Scarlet Witch there, and she is at least in red inside, or scarlet. And you've got the Mastermind, of course, demonstrating some of his powers. Of course, later on, the Hellfire Club, and of course, Dark Phoenix, etc. But again, you've got obviously Professor X there, sort of deciding to do various things about the evil mutants and Magneto. You can see obviously the evil mutants there in a Republic. Now, I don't know if they ever did that later, but you'd think they would just do that more often, wouldn't you? But still, once they've done it once, they obviously didn't do it again. And you've got Quicksilver whizzing through and battling the various characters. I really loved Quicksilver. I must admit, when I was younger, that was one of the powers I thought, you know what, I would love to have that. I didn't actually read Flash at that point. I should have read Flash, and I'm certain I would have gone and said, who's quicker, Flash or Quicksilver? Of course, there has been many other super speed characters over the years, but you got here, of course, the X-Men, of course, eventually beat them. But the next story, trapped by one X-Men, we've got the evil mutants back. Why not have a good thing? You've got this great thing, the Angel Strike. I think this was the earliest X-Men comic I ever had, that I ever bought, the American copy, and I love this one. I always slightly regret getting rid of that one. Always the way, you get rid of one, but still, I love the Toad here. That's just absolutely brilliant. And of course, the next story, we had Submariner, which was even great, because of course Submariner, there was always a sort of talk about him being a mutant, but joins the evil mutants. Obviously, that was a sort of, yes, he's going to join, but obviously in the end, we know he didn't. But there's joined I love the way that H they put there. You got to see the blast there, and of course going through there, and you've got all the various. Quite dangerous having a character doing that, isn't it? Certainly very dangerous. And of course you've got him going through trying. Again, this is something I don't think he used a few times, but he could sort of travel there and discuss various things. I love that bit. But Submariner, super. The evil mutants would have been really unstoppable if they ended up with him, but of course. Submariner is never going to join a team. But until he did, of course, he eventually joined the Avengers. And he got the return of the Blob. Of course, this was the thing that and also they've obviously got their diplomas there, which I think was a great touch as well. And of course, you've got here, you can see Magneto sort of does this thing, and there's a mental block. And of course, luckily, he gets over that. And you've got the Blob, joins forces with Magneto, etc. And he walks away, of course, at the end. And then we've got another character, Unus, the Untouchable, which I always thought was a pretty cool character, but of course did suffer from a slight problem that if you've got an untouchable power, you definitely need to be able to turn it off, because if you can't, how do you do anything? In fact, I always wondered about the untouchable bit, how light could get through as well, but still, I guess the power was very selective, and also air as well, these sort of things. But I love, of course, these things. I think actually this is the first one. Let's visit the X-Men. I mean, wow. I mean, I love letters pages. They're just great because you read, obviously, what people's opinions were at the time. So it's always fascinating. Now, obviously, we've got different opinions about these early issues. Some people love them, some people don't. But you can see the sort of things that people were sort of considering at the time. You know, they thought this was great, that was great, this character should come back, etc. And also, of course, we've got these as well, which I think are really good. The special pin-up, the Beast, I think they went through quite a few of these ones. But again, you've got another one there. And I always, of course, love these sort of things, the checklist of all the various stories. They're always just great to look and think, oh, you know what, I must get the Avengers or whatever, Astonish, those sort of issues. Then we got this one, The Return of Professor X. Don't miss The Return of Professor X. And we learned a little bit about Professor X, of course, there. Enter the Avengers. They always did this, these lovely crossovers. And for me at the time, I think the crossovers were just great because, of course, they were, in a sense, they were special. Now, of course, it seems that crossovers happen all the time. So they cease to become, of course, as special as that. But, of course, it was inevitable always when the heroes, of course, would meet up. There would always be the battle, and you'd have the characters. Obviously, Giant Man, Iceman would be battling this, or you'd have Cyclops. Now, I think Cyclops should have battled against Beast. It would have been a great. There was always those sort of combinations. Who should be battling who? I mean, Thor versus Thor, of course, completely unstoppable for all the characters. But Lucifer character, never a particular fan of Lucifer character, but we got there that story, the world that time forgot, and Kazar, or however you want to say, the coming of Kazar, just great. Of course, this character was in the earliest days of Marvel Comics, in the Timely Comics. He had his own stories. Now, it wasn't the same one, but still we had, obviously, the Zabu, etc. I'm always quite surprised still that there's been no Omnibus collection, as far as I'm aware, or even an Epic collection for poor old Kazar. There might be. Someone probably going to correct me on that. There's been a few Omnibus, but later on ones, but certainly not these early ones. The Astonishing Tales, etc., as well as, of course, the X-Men and the Daredevil Spider-Man ones as well. I'm just always, why? Why have they neglected the poor guy? I know he's a bit of a knockoff Tarzan, but I always enjoyed his character. And you got here the Triumph of Magneto, and you got the Stranger, which was a sort of a nice little story, and actually really an introduction to what was going to be coming later in the Marvel Universe, where we, of course, got Thanos and all the Collector and all those, the Grandmaster and things. You got the Stranger. I think this is probably near enough really the first that these sort of massively powerful beings. I might be wrong on that. Maybe some of the stories. Obviously, we had the Watcher. Now, I don't know if the Watcher's story came before this, but Stranger clearly was one of those sort of Q-level powered sort of beings that sort of was unstoppable. Basically, the X-Men were out of their league, so was Magneto. And, of course, you can see there later on in the story. But next story, which, of course, it's got some very odd art. And at the time, I must admit, I thought, oh, that's very strange. Well, obviously not at the time. But when I first read them, and these were, I think, they were fantastic in the UK. And, of course, later we got them in the Mighty Worlds of Marvel's, was it Titans? I think it was Titans. But here you got Juggernaut. Just dramatic cover, the origin of Professor X. So we learn even more about Professor X, the almost indescribable menace. Almost. I love the almost bit. Now, he wasn't unstoppable because he does have a few weaknesses. Well, one big weakness, and that obviously is used in this. But you can see obviously there, it's screaming. Oh my! And you can see that at this point we haven't really seen, but he can tell a bit about obviously what's going to be happening. Unstoppable because obviously the mystical powers there. And then you actually see now Juggernaut. Actually, when you see him, he looks a bit, I have to say, a slightly silly looking character. But still, you wouldn't want to face him on the Dark Knight. But he's obviously clearly unstoppable, but he has problems against the team. But luckily, we got the a great old crossover with the Human Torch, which I think is absolutely good. There he is, the Human Torch there. Or is that the Human Torch at that point? No, there he is. He's coming like a bit flames beforehand. Sort of introduction into the Human Torch. He flies off again. No, I don't know how he did that. That's pretty clever. He must have got out of the car and then went off, I guess. Otherwise, the car would have melted. Couldn't have happened all the time. Must have got through a lot of cars. But still, at that point, he didn't. Actually, it still would have melted, wouldn't it, properly? But anyway, now we got the Sentinels. Sentinels? I think that's how you say it. But they changed slightly. They are slightly different from, of course, the way that we see them now. But at this point, they were pretty powerful beings. They were obviously created to basically stop the X-Men, and they could handle any of the powers. But over time, of course, they become really very unstoppable and proved to be quite a, obviously, consistent menace for the X-Men. And you, of course, got here the Master Mold as well. And you got Beam coming out there, blasting away. And, of course, he was obviously trying to find out the secrets, etc., about them. You can see there, obviously, the processing power. Now, I don't know if they obviously still producing the Sentinels. I guess they still are in mass production somewhere. But what we have got, which was this, I really enjoyed this story. This was one with and none shall survive, because there was something obviously happened in the previous story, and we got all the X-Men. There was problems. This was the thing about the Marvel Universe. It didn't end nicely sometimes. I mean, obviously, in the end, they did. They all got back, but none shall survive. Well, of course, but it had a dramatic red cover. I love that cover. That was just such a great, of course, revealing later on who the menace was. You can guess who the menace was, but it was, I thought it was a great one, because you just didn't know, and they got, obviously, things were wrapping around. Big clue there, of course, at this point. And there he is. We know who's going to be the villain in this one. It's good old Magneto. He's back again. Slight problem for him later, but that's a different issue. There he is, obviously, magnetic attraction. So he's using his abilities to... I think the Magneto seemed to often forget he had these powers, because he never sometimes he uses them, sometimes he doesn't. It's like all the superheroes in Marvel Universe. And you can see there, he's obviously Magneto is battling away. Obviously, Iceman has been saving the day. And we got on to the next story, which was, for me, I love this one, The Mimic. Now shall appear the Mimic. And the great thing about the Mimic, he had all the powers. A bit like Super Adaptoid, and what his name was in the DC one, Amazo, all these sort of people. There's people, and of course the Heroes one where Sylar, all those sort of people have these powers to be able to get all the powers, and quite useful. But I felt that they missed the opportunity with this character. It would have been nice to have had a bit more extending being a hero. Of course, later on the story finishes in with the Hulk issue, but I still think it was a great character, which I don't think they used enough. They could have used him a lot more, but they didn't. And again, you got Lucifer back again. The artwork had changed at this point, of course. We got some very weird... They had some weird characters in the X-Men. They were not often the best of characters, and Lucifer definitely was not one of those characters that really sort of... we changed the thing. We've got just X-Men there. Let's visit the X-Men this time. Lovely X. They divide these books often with, obviously that was Marvel Masterworks, probably 3 Marvel Masterworks. And you've got, again, another one of this. Then we got here, Count Nefari. I never say his name right. Anyway, the Count. And we got here, obviously, some minor characters. The Unicorn, etc. The Eel. And, of course, later on, I think there was that Whirlwind. So that was the Avengers one where he sort of gets the powers. But I still quite enjoyed these stories. They were still, the covers sometimes were pretty daft looking. I think that there's just, especially we got the X-Men sort of like in the distance, you've got these characters. Because I think sometimes that Marvel often would do, obviously, alternate covers. And I would have thought they would have turned it around and had the X-Men at the front and the villains at the back. But still, you got that. And then you got this weird character that actually again was in another one of these Marvel annuals, I think. There was this one, The Plague of the Locust. Now, he did turn up later again, but this one, Plague of the Lotus, it was a good character. You got obviously a bit like Ant-Man, I guess, but instead it was Locust Man. And, of course, he makes the locust grow. That's pretty risky. You wouldn't want to face them this one, Power Independent. I really enjoyed this one, El Tigre. This one. Now, that's That's an interesting cover. Again, you got there. Actually, what's happened to poor old... Oh, probably disappearing from the storyline. Because suddenly, Marvel Girl's not on the cover there. And likewise again. Well, we got here Holocaust. One thing I did like about the X-Men, they always had the occasional story, and that sort of faded away, I think. But they would have it in a cafe. And I enjoyed that. I know it's probably not what everyone wants. People go to the comics for the action excitement. But I quite like the soap opera element of these sort of stories, like she would meet various people and there'll be other romance sort of thing. I enjoyed that. It's not for everyone. I know some people really just don't like that. But I thought it was just great. Absolutely fine. And then, of course, got Marvel Girl back again, re-enter the Mimic. Again, a character that should have been used, I think, a lot more. And, of course, you've got the evil Puppet Master. Puppet Master. I was never a fan of the Puppet Master. With the Fantastic Four, etc., of course, Submariner, he was always doing it. Why he just didn't use it for good, I do not know. But that's the same with many of them. Of course, also got the Banshee as well. But then you got the problem for Mimic. Of course, goes too far away, he loses his power. That is a bit of a serious weakness, losing the power. You'd think he'd have it for an hour. Give it an hour, like an hour sort of thing. But no, limitation on the distance. Probably the way to beat him, of course. You just make certain all the superpower beings are a certain distance away for a period of time, and then you've virtually won because he hasn't got any powers anymore. It seems a bit of a limitation. Then you've got this weird character. What can't remember his name now? The Ogre or something, wasn't it? But Super Adaptoid. Mentioned the Super Adaptoid before, and you of course got the Mimic, and there's obviously there. You could be, etc. Join has become sort of one of the powers to be. But, of course, that doesn't work out. And, of course, you've got this is near enough an Avengers crossover, Avengers versus X-Men crossover. And I think the action's just great. Sort of, don't do it sort of thing. And you can see, obviously, throat blasting the arrows there, Hawkeye's arrows. And, of course, got, weirdly, Captain America's shield, but, of course, not the circular one, but the more original, timely comics Captain America one that he had. And, of course, he uses his powers. But there's a problem. Let's turn away so you can't see it. Now, the artwork really gets a bit weird here. This was one of the weird ones. I think this is, have to say, very odd. Jack Sparling one. Designer. Weird. Designer. John, and I can't say his name, Tartalone. Anyway, the Warlock wakes. Now, I think the Warlock was supposed to be Merlin. So you've got some very odd artwork, very odd story. And, of course, there's a bit of a thing there with Marvel Girl again, Jean Grey. And, of course, we've got these lovely scenes here, which I loved. I love that, where you always would sort of freeze the coffee. Pretty useful, that, isn't it? I suppose Human Torch did the other way around. Probably be boiling. That would not be so good. But you got Cobalt Man. Now, he did turn up again. I think I've just been reading the Hulk, because, of course, there's the Hulk Omnibus Volume 3 coming out, or is out. I'm just going to be guessing that, hopefully very soon. But you've got Cobalt Man looking very much like Iron Man. I think basically Iron Man. And then you got this at the back. That's it. We got to issue 31. And we've got this, which I think, I love these ones. These T-shirt ones. I never got them. They should do these again. I don't know why they haven't. But you got, and I was looking at some T-shirts today, and they had Deadpool and Wolverine. I was thinking, you know what, I still prefer that old X-Men one. That would be brilliant. Need to bring them out. You got these. Of course, these are the early issues. I mean, just great, isn't it, that they still exist? Because, of course, a lot of these ones are long gone, but I just think it's lovely. I really enjoy seeing these early stories like that. And I love these things as well. These were just great. Who says this isn't a Marvel? And they got modelling with Millie, Patsy. Again, ones that should have their own omnibus editions, but haven't, which is always such a pity. And you got here Kid Colt, etc. Though weirdly, no, Millie. Of course, it's got the classic Avengers. I love that one. And you of course got these as well. They did a few stories later on when they did it. They added a little bit of I don't know why they did that. Why they had to, and this sort of weird sort of thing, very odd. And also having that, sort of like the old Justice League of America, we jumped down the side, I suppose, in that case. Oh, talk about, there it is. Down the side, you got the side. I suppose they didn't have the evil mutants down this side. That would have been a good way. And then, of course, you've got obviously the covers that they used in Marvel Masterworks, and then the omnibus without that. But that is a run through of that. Well, before we finish, I've got this as well. So I've got the wonderful here, Submariner and the Evil. One thing I love about the British ones was you got them in quite a large size, and the artwork is really quite sharp. most cases. And also it was the same in the Mighty World of Marvel and other ones. I always thought they're just great. And of course this Submariner one, joins the evil mutants. You've got this guy obviously here being convinced he should betray everyone. Which, an evil plan. An evil plan. And there's always, in the course, super. Now, we often, in the course in the UK, we get, and this is falling apart, you got here superhero or supervillain. We find out the week after. So I think that's a great one. I mentioned Taschen. The Taschen book looks amazing. It's quite expensive. When it comes out in omnibus, small omnibus-sized format, smaller format, maybe I might look for that. But I have got also this, which is really good as well. Of course, if you don't want to get the omnibus, you've got many of these stories. And this one goes all the way up to wherever it is, X-Men 1-24. So 1-24. So the omnibus does have a few more. But of course, you've got this lovely artwork here, which of course is brilliant. You've got the Mimic story, you've got the Sentinels. I always really love black and white as well. I think black and white's really good. The Blob story, X-Men, obviously against Submariner, etc., and the evil mutants. That's fairly early, essential, canny X-Men. So that is a run through of the X-Men Omnibus Volume 1, which is, I think, some great stories. Now, I haven't got Volume 2. I've never bought Volume 2. And of course, after that, issue 66, of course, was the last of that sort of epic original X-Men. And then, of course, we had reprints after that. And, of course, those were reprinted. I bought quite a few of those. I did enjoy those. So that's a run-through of the Omnibus. Have you got this volume? I mean, obviously, it's been out for a while. I don't know if they brought out a new version. They often bring out new volumes, obviously, maybe doing a few changes, or it's near enough identical to the thing. Now, I have noticed, one thing I'm just going to point out, because I have noticed here, and this one's not so bad. There, the Marvel Omnibus, this red, I've noticed it really does fade. I've been fairly careful with how I store my omnibus. I think I have anyway. Obviously, just any sunlight seems to really fade that. I don't know if you've noticed that. Please put in the comments below if you've noticed a similar sort of problem. Do you find... And I've got a situation where some are worse than others. This one actually looks quite reasonable, but it is something I've noticed more and more, that a lot of my old omnibuses, I've got a slight... When you put them together especially... So you see them all and they don't move. So some seem to just go, you think, well, that's weird. Why is that one slightly fading away compared with the other one? Very strange. Now, I haven't noticed that with DC. The DC ones seem to be very reasonable and don't seem to fade. But the Marvel ones do. I don't know why. Very odd. But I thought I'd just point that one out. Again, it'd be nice to hear your comments and thoughts about that. Anyway, thoughts, questions, always great to hear from you.